about you. Please tell us a story about your job as a TV reporter.
Well, it was many years ago.
Inequality is on the rise. Aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, it has taken away people's lives and dreams. Inflation went up, driven by food and fuel prices, disproportionately affecting the poor. In Asia and the Pacific, the pandemic has doubled the multidimensional poverty level. An additional 85 million people could have been pushed back into extreme poverty, living on $1.9 per day or less. We need to take urgent action, but how?
Our region is experiencing a highly uneven or so-called K-shaped recovery between countries and within countries. Building forward fairer, ensuring an inclusive recovery from the pandemic, and taking an inclusive development path is an imperative.
Thank you, Mrs. Scap. So, how do we leave no one behind? We can't simply return to normal, can we? That normal is blamed for inequality in the first place.
Governments should prioritize spending on healthcare, education, and social protection.
Of course, but increasing spending is not a golden solution. We must spend smart to heal the long-term scars left by the pandemic.
We need to prioritize universal basic healthcare services over everything else. Children receiving high-quality education from their early years is our priority. We must shield people in need, vulnerable groups, and informal workers.
Tax fare should be the leading principle for obtaining budget revenues. Nobody and no company should avoid paying their share. Prevention is always better than cure. Before taxes and transfers, we must focus on pre-distributive policies. It's important that we set up countries for success through strong political systems that allow for checks and balances, strong institutional arrangements, and enough job-rich structural transformation that creates opportunities for all. Fast transformation and new technologies will be disruptive. Governments should act more proactively to guide their direction, shape their trajectory, and manage shocks for inclusive outcomes. Can central banks play a role in inclusive development?
We can and we should. I believe it's time for us to step up our game and tackle rises in inequality. Right now, only half of the central banks in the region are taking up an inclusive finance agenda, and it's such a missed opportunity. As policymakers, we can make the conduct of monetary policy more mindful about inequality. As investors, we can mobilize part of the $9.1 trillion official reserves in the Asia-Pacific region for social purposes. As currency issuers, we can explore how central bank digital currencies can foster financial inclusion. As financial regulators, we can encourage more use of innovative financial instruments for inclusive development.
Thank you, colleagues. In looking ahead, the Asia-Pacific region must aim for inclusive recovery to promote the well-being of both people and the planet.
Do you maybe have clear and ready-to-use guidelines to tackle inequality?
As a matter of fact, we do. Download the ESCAP flagship publication. Follow our recommendations for building forward fairer.
And it worked, right? It worked, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Right. All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. We're pleased to have you all join us today for our launch of the 2022 edition of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. This is one of our key flagship reports of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And we're very pleased to have 4 distinguished speakers with us today. We have, of course, the Executive Secretary of ESCAP, Ms. Armida Alice Jabana. We also have a special keynote from Professor Lant Pritchett of Oxford University. And then we have Hamza Malik, who is the Director of the Macroeconomic Policy Division, and Shweta Saxena, who is the lead author of the survey itself. So today's format, we'll hear from each of the speakers, and then we'll hopefully have a little bit of time reserved at the end for everybody with a little bit of question and answering. We have about an hour for today's program. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to Madam Executive Secretary. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mitch. Very good morning, very good afternoon. Warm welcome to all colleagues, and thank you for joining us at the launch of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia Pacific 2022. When the pandemic struck just over 2 years ago, it was not clear how devastating an impact it would have on people and economies. And today, while we are still far from the end of the pandemic, we have to deal with yet another crisis, the impact of worsening geopolitical situation. The Economic and Social Survey of Asia and Pacific 2022 sheds light on what has transpired over the last 2 years, how far we have come, and how best to build forward fairer. Although our economies have rebounded somewhat from the worst, this recovery in economic growth is more unequal than before. The benefits of the recovery have not reached where it is needed the most. Since the start of the pandemic, about 85 million people in our region have been pushed into extreme poverty, while millions more suffer disproportionately from its effects. As a result, economists and policymakers are focusing again on the ever-existing threat to economic growth, prosperity, and certainly the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In many ways, what we are facing now is the pandemic of economic inequalities. It is not enough to merely recover from this pandemic, but what we would like to see is a better, fairer, and more inclusive future for all. This requires us to reflect back on what we have before and on how to set it in a better direction. Just to cite a few examples, investment in people through spending on education, healthcare, and social protection have been far too low in our developing Asia-Pacific region. Central banks have not promoted financial inclusion and financial equality strongly enough. People-centered policymaking has not always been the priority. Even today, about 820 million workers in our region remain in the informal sector or informal economy, as the economic growth model did not prioritize their inclusion and long-term well-being. As the survey has argued in recent years, there is potential for a massive change towards a fair and inclusive future. This year's survey provides a direction for macroeconomic policies to do so. Dear colleagues, 2 years of the pandemic have squeezed the fiscal space, pushing governments towards consolidations. Debt challenges multiplied, fiscal revenues are not growing fast enough to match the mounting fiscal expenditure needs. Therefore, this year's survey reminds us that we need to spend smart. We need to preserve expenditures in 3 areas to ensure an inclusive future. Those are investment in education, investment in universal health care for all, investment in social protection floors. At the same time, these measures need to be complemented with a tax-fair policy. Tax revenues in our region are among the lowest in the world. However, Tapping into these resources will require a strong push towards tax compliance, cutting tax evasion and avoidance, and formalization of the economy. Moreover, these fiscal policy recommendations have benefited greatly from accelerated digitalization, especially since the past 2 years. It has accelerated the needed change in fiscal policy management on the expenditure and revenue side, ensuring efficiency, transparency, and delivery of data for evidence-driven policymaking. However, tackling inequality should not be the job of the governments alone, as is often assumed. Central banks should and can play a bigger role. Central banks can foster equitable societies in many ways. When adjusting the policy rate, they can analyze how this will affect different groups of people. On official reserve management, instead of putting all reserves in short-term financial instruments, part of them can be invested, for example, in social bonds. Central bank digital currency also presents potential to improve financial inclusion. Finally, the survey reminds us that inequality is closely linked to structural changes in the economy. Inclusive development relies on the rapid creation of more productive jobs, equal access to economic opportunities, and the empowerment of workers in the market distribution of income. On the verge of the fourth industrial revolution, where new technologies will reshape the entire economy at an unprecedented depth and pace, it is time to ensure that inclusiveness is interwoven into the fabric of structural changes. This means promoting labor-friendly transformation, empowering workers, investing in reskilling, lifelong learning, and job market intermediation. The pandemic has certainly given us an opportunity to rethink our future. Let us make the most out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Executive Secretary, for that very nice overview of the survey. It's my pleasure and honor now to turn the floor over to Professor Lant Pritchett. He is Research Director at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government and a Fellow at the London School of Economics. Professor Pritchett, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored and pleased to be asked to give a speech in connection with the launch of this report. I've looked at the report materials and read the report, and it really is, I think, important and path-breaking in many respects. And I am not going to sort of talk specifically about the report because others are better equipped to do that, but I do want to sort of talk about how the report fits into three larger kind of global debates about development and progress, and stress ways in which I think the thinking is changing and needs to change more. And to reflect in particular the kind of theme of building forward fair. So the first thing I really like about the report and a way in which I feel the discourse is changing is, and I've tried to come up with I have three major points, and I want a kind of clear, memorable phrase to remember each of them. I think much of the global debate, or let me start with the positive. This report avoids a problem that I feel pervades sometimes discourse about policy, which is debating the color of your unicorn. A lot of times, it seems to me, people are debating whether they would rather have a purple unicorn or a green unicorn or a rainbow unicorn or a polka dot unicorn. And the deep point is, from a deep reality check point of view, all colors of unicorns don't exist. There are no green unicorns, there are no purple unicorns, there are no polka dot unicorns. So debating what you would like to imagine to happen. On the other hand, if you are talking about horses, one can talk about the way in which one would like to care and feed the horse. And the reason I say this is two things that I think are very important. One is that part of the emphasis of this report is on effective social services, effective basic education, effective universal health care, effective social protection schemes. And the important point about that is we shouldn't want or be satisfied just with inclusion into low quality services. And in order for people to be included into high quality services, there have to be high quality services. And those high quality services need to be provided in a way that are effective for everyone, including groups that might have otherwise been marginalized for them. But one cannot include somebody into a high quality education system unless you have a high quality education system. So as was mentioned in the introduction, one of my main research agendas these days is the quality of basic education. And within the Asia region, in the recent survey of the PISA, which is the program for evaluating and assessing 15-year-olds around the world, a number of poorer countries, poorer than usually participate in PISA, participated in a round called PISA for Development. And I think one of the really important lessons that emerged from the analysis that I've been doing and others have been doing of that data is that the main difference in outcomes of learning between countries in the world, and two of the countries that participated in PISA or PISA for Development were Cambodia and Vietnam, which are right next to each other, is not in fact how inclusive their education systems are, but how effective their education systems are. So what we did in a piece of analysis is we compared the PISA achievements or assessments of kids who were advantaged in all of the empirically observable respects. They were male, they were urban, they were native speakers of the language, they weren't immigrants, and who were in the socioeconomic status elite for their country. And what you found was that the advantaged socioeconomic elite, the top 5th percentile of children in Cambodia, had PISA results that were substantially below the UN Social Development Goal of PISA level 2 as the minimum learning level. So the elites of Cambodia were well below the global minimum threshold. In a context like that, the emphasis has to be on effective. Somehow, Cambodia is lacking an effective education system that can bring that. So I think the report's emphasis on building for a fairer emphasizes effectiveness of the services and then inclusion into those effective services. And keeping those two things twinned, I think, are very important. Including children into an ineffective education system that isn't in fact building the foundational skills that children need is a false promise. And until you have the strong, capable horse of an effective system, debating exactly the features of a horse you don't have and debating the features of a unicorn isn't very helpful. So the first thing I think that this report is very strong on is emphasizing that it's the noun that matters as much as the adjectives, and appending 6 adjectives to an imaginary noun just doesn't do us very many good. So let's focus on how we're dealing with the concrete realities, and I think effective social services is a really important way, and then including people into those effective social services is an important step. The second is thing that I really like about this report, and I think a way in which the report is helping to change the global discourse, is there's been 2 radically different views of what inclusive growth might mean. And one of them has always been kind of a exclusive view of inclusive growth, or exclusive growth and then try to fix it later. So the reports focus on the pre-distribution, the actual distribution of incomes that's generated prior to tax and transfer, versus too much attention on programs that redistribute income after the generation of incomes and opportunities in the market, I think is really singularly important. I wrote a paper many years ago about the fact that in Latin America, for instance, using Latin America as an example, every kid in Latin America grows up believing that if they're the best soccer player, they can play for the national team. Go into any neighborhood and kids are playing soccer and they have, or football, and they have they really believe that if they turn out to be the next Lionel Messi and really are a high quality soccer player, they will be given the chance to play both for themselves, for the team, and for the national team. So it's an inclusive process of discovering the emerging talents, re-awarding those talents, developing those talents, and they can really play on the team. So they're contributing. So I think the emphasis on the equalization of productivity of people is really vitally important. Let's make sure everyone is productive so that everybody's really playing on the team. And I think that's important in two ways. One, it just is the fact that if one looks at poverty headcount rates or the outcomes on poverty at any of the poverty thresholds used in the report of $1.90, $3.20, or $5.50 a day, it's just fundamentally extremely tightly connected to the productivity of the typical individual. So if you focus on the income of the typical individual, you will in fact be working on what it takes to reduce poverty for everyone. Much in part because the efficacy of the tax transfer system to remediate the underlying defects is just going to be weaker than if you focus on equalizing productivity in the first place and equalizing opportunity in the first place. So I think, so that's one really important reason why the kind of metaphor of everyone playing on the team, everyone being a chance to develop their talents, everyone's talents is having an ability to emerge and be rewarded by the system is really, really vitally important. And second, I think a reason why the emphasis of an inclusive economy is that often the inclusiveness of the economy can bring ancillary positive social changes in a way that's difficult for the tax transfer system to do that. And let me just give one example. I was part of some research with some Dalit authors from India that emphasize the change in the conditions, the social conditions in rural Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the most difficult social regions in the world, and how that evolved as the Indian economy transformed. And what this research showed was that as the opportunities for Dalits to participate through migration to cities and finding jobs in cities completely changed the social structure of the village in a way that allowed Dalits to make social progress that had been blocked and stagnating for 100 years. So oftentimes it was the access to sources of productivity and income that changed the economic relations, that changed the social relations. So I think a truly inclusive and productive economy gives people a chance to not just forward their economic status, but their social status as well. And so in a way that just having excluded these excluding groups, kept them in rural areas, kept them in low-paying, low-productivity activities, not included into the dynamism of the modern economy, wouldn't have had in any way, shape, or form the same socially positive and socially transformative effects on the social structure. So there's positive feedback links there. The last point I want to make is in the structural transformation, I very much like the focus on jobs. And in particular, one of the points the report makes is establish correct market signals for private sector technological choices. And I think this is vitally important in a way that I think is so far radically under recognized. And the phrase I want you to remember here, like, don't debate the color of the unicorn, make sure everybody's playing for team productivity. And the third kind of phrase is, not all who wander are lost, and not all who lead should be followed. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that in the richest countries of the world, they have established very restrictive migration policies. That means that they have these dramatic shortages of low to medium skilled labor that are entirely a result of the labor restrictive policies that they create. There's no shortage of labor in the world, but there's a shortage of labor in Denmark. There's a shortage of labor in the United States. What that means is the economic incentives of the most highly scarcest resources in the world are devoted to economizing on the use of the most abundant resources in the world. So you have Elon Musk, the Google twins, Jeff Bezos, you have the billionaires running some of the world's largest, most profitable corporations focused on developing technology like self-driving cars or self-driving trucks that economize on the use of labor. That, from a global perspective, is totally, completely nuts. They're not responding to true scarcities in the world. They're not responding to truly what is available in the world. They're responding to an extremely distorted environment. So the market signals for technological change in the rich world are the single most erroneous price signals in the world, full stop. Which means that the technological leadership in the world is on entirely the wrong path. They are on a jobs destroying technological path that isn't the result of market forces. The market, the global economy is not saying economize on labor. The global economy is saying create jobs for the labor that is there, create jobs that create productivity, inclusive productivity. So the technological leaders of the world are responding to wildly distorted economic incentives given their domestic conditions, and they should not be seen as leaders to be followed. The Asia region needs to say, how do we make use of our abundant resource, which is often people, and pursuing the illusion that any technological leadership is therefore a trend to be followed will mislead, because that technological leadership, again, is not responding to correct market signals about scarcity in the world. They're responding to conditions created by misguided policies of their home countries. So not all who wander are lost, not all who lead should be followed. So I think on these three big issues, this report is making important contributions, which is focus on the reality of creating an effective set of services and growth, and then focus on inclusive into those effective services, inclusive into that growth. Without growth, if you have zero growth, whether it's inclusive or not, doesn't matter. It's like a purple versus a green unicorn. If you don't have an effective education system, the inclusiveness of people into that ineffective education system is a purple or a green unicorn. So focus on the reality of the horse, not the color of the unicorn. Focus on productivity, inclusiveness of productivity. Let's get all people playing for team productivity in a way that realizes their talents. And third, not all who wander are lost, not all who lead should be followed. The the Asia region should not just blindly follow the technological leadership of people who were responding to wildly distorted market incentives created by their own restrictive migration policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lant. That was a very interesting way of looking at some of the points made in the report. Thank you very much for those insights. Moving on, our next speaker is Mr. Hamza Malik. He is the Director of the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division here at ESCAP. And Hamza is going to be speaking a little bit about the survey and economic performance of the region. Hamza, over to you.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Professor Pritchett. That was enlightening, informative. Can you put up the slides, please? Just give me a second while I wait. Okay.
Can you see the slide now?
Yes, got it. Next, please. Next slide. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon from Bangkok. Warm welcome once again to the launch of the 2022 issue of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. I'm going to try and take you quickly through the big picture messages and points regarding the macroeconomic picture in general, and my colleague then, Shweta, will take you through some of the most specific details of the theme for this year's research, which has been on inclusive recovery and development. So the big picture, the fundamental backdrop, the point is concerns about persistent inequalities have been there for a while. ESCAP has been highlighting these issues in its various publications for the last several years. Asia Pacific region stands out for the wrong reason in this particular vein. Inequality has risen quite a bit. The rate of increase is much sharper than compared to other regions, and so on and so forth. What to do about it? So there have been talks, there have been discussions, there have been policy proposals circulating around. In comes COVID pandemic, and that has certainly brought the issue to the fore once again. As we saw in the last couple of years, those who were actually more in need were actually felt the more severe impact of the COVID pandemic on multiple dimensions. So as an economist, we try to zero in a bit more on the role of macroeconomic policies. What more can be done? What is missing? What are the lessons that we have learned from the past? How we can build it forward, and what we call build forward further in order to do that. So you will listen and you will hear in more detail how macroeconomic policies, traditional policies like fiscal and monetary policies, and some structured policies can actually do that role. The second thing is, when we look at the last 1 or 2 years' performance, of course, there was unprecedented response from policymakers when it came to addressing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, and it did result in reasonably strong economic rebound, but people have been left behind. So this essentially calls for attention to inclusive policies. So this is the reason why we zeroed in on potential of inclusive recovery and development. So in 2022 survey, you will see a lot more details on that. We try to push the boundaries of traditional macroeconomic thinking and provide some new insights within the mainstream kind of policy that I've discussed, such as fiscal policy, central banking issues, structural transformation, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. So this is what we see in 2021. The basic estimates, we had a massive reduction in 2020, and followed by a very strong economic rebound. Primarily, I would say, supported by a very, very unprecedented response from the governments, both in the shape of fiscal measures and a lot of measures coming from central banks as well. Next slide. So the region clocked in at about 7.1% on average in terms of GDP growth. This rebound primarily supported by robust external demand. As you can see, the orange line is China's trend, and then you have developing Asia for the rest of excluding China in the gray line, and you can see a rising trajectory since about mid-2020 onwards, and that has actually supported the recovery in the Asia Pacific region. Next slide. So in turn, there are, of course, links between the ability to support the robust external demand from the region for the manufacturing industrial production taking place in the region. And again, we can see easily both manufacturing and servicing PMI, the red and blue lines, again, are showing rising trends since the mid of 2020 onwards. So that is the sort of combination of robust external demand supported by strong manufacturing response, services response from the region, translating into a sort of strong rebound in 2021. Next, please. So this is all good, but we still estimate that the level of output is still about 2% below the pre-pandemic level, which is about $2 trillion have been sort of lost had pandemic not taken place. Next slide. And at the same time, what we're going to talk a little bit more about the recovery actually is what we call nascent. It's not clear, it's not settled. It's strong, but it's sort of fading away. As you can see, for instance, these are the sub-regional growth trends between East and Northeast Asia, orange line, North and Central Asia being the red, Southeast Asia the blue, and South and Southwest Asia in the green line. So you can easily see around June 2021 onwards, about third quarter 2021 onwards, there has been deceleration in the rate of recovery, primarily explained by the Delta COVID variant that emerged and again caused disruption to economic activities. So there is still a recovery is not very strong. It's not keeping the same momentum, and there is unevenness between countries. Next slide. And we see the same trends within the countries that different sectors are actually recovering on it at a different pace. So transport and hospitality, for instance, are lagging behind compared to manufacturing and wholesale trade. Next slide. And after a very long time, we are seeing a reasonably strong rising trend in inflationary measures, even if you take aside the relatively temporary measures like commodity or food prices, even then the core inflation measures are also showing a rising trend. And in many instances, as you can see, they have surpassed the targets of central banks. So inflation is becoming a sort of a policy agenda once again in the region. And the pandemic-related expansionary fiscal and monetary response, which supported the strong recovery, of course, has had a role to play in this inflation. It was needed in some case, but more recently, due to other shocks that I'll highlight, now we're seeing rising trends in global commodity prices and food prices. Next slide, please. So the outlook actually is extremely difficult right now to figure out how to assess, how to analyze this, what we call riddle with serious uncertainty. The region as a whole has not yet fully recovered from the COVID pandemic, and now it's facing renewed shocks in the form of the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on, and it has many multifaceted impacts across the globe. Asia-Pacific region economies are not immune to that. So recovery is a little bit, we expect that it's going to moderate the pace quite a bit from 7.1 estimate for 2021. We are projecting the average GDP forecast for 2022 to be around 4.5% with a slight upward trajectory around 5%. So that's going to be a deceleration happening at the way we see at the moment. But it's again too early to say anything for sure. Full resumption, of course, depends on whether we're going to have availability of vaccines in different countries, a new variant of COVID pandemic, and associated disruptions that the COVID pandemic has been causing in the last couple of years. I alluded to the Russian-Ukraine conflict is causing spikes in food prices, commodity prices, and that is having repercussions across the globe. It's causing disruption to trade activities, to supply chains, causing massive increase in uncertainty, risk appetite gone down, which is not good for investment, so on and so forth. So that's going to have a dampening effect on the region's economic outlook. And inflation, as I already showed you, was already on a rising trend. And now because of the impact of the Russian-Ukraine conflict is probably going to go up, which in all likelihood means the interest rates in the region are likely to go up as well. Next slide, please. So what the kind of policy you'll see we discuss, one, our recommendation is economies now need to learn to coexist with the pandemic. Simply means they need to pay attention to promoting livelihoods while having the capacity to deal with the impact of the pandemic on people's lives. So they have to invest in the health system. So they have to strike a balance between the two, but largely the response that was there before in terms of very strict lockdowns, I think we have graduated from that phase and should graduate from that phase and learn to coexist with the pandemic. Macro instability in some countries is rising, debt distress is rising, of course, so we call for prudent fiscal and monetary policies, and simply means that while countries would love to continue to support recovery efforts, the actual conditions may not allow them to do the case, to be the case. For instance, as I said, inflation is on the rise. So those countries are already experiencing very high inflationary pressures beyond their target range, may not be able to have lower interest rates for long, for instance. Similarly, countries that lack fiscal space will struggle continuing to provide the much needed fiscal support. So the policy focus has to be on how to create fiscal space, which you'll see some ideas in Shweta's presentation. Policies need to be prioritizing on reducing inequality. That's the part we're going to go in more detail. So you hear much more from Shweta on that. And one fundamental message we have been highlighting for the last couple of years, that while policymakers pursue and focus on rapid and high economic growth rates, they need to actually invest enough in building resilience into the system to be able to have the economies avoid the massive setbacks that happen when severe shocks like COVID pandemic happens. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we were talking about why to focus on inequality. Well, it has affected actually people on more vulnerable sections of society much more acutely. Informal workers, women and youth, for instance. We see that in the data. Next slide, please. So that's one reason. Our estimates, latest estimates actually show that 85 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty in last year. And the numbers are even higher when we look at the alternative yardstick of, for instance, $3.2 per day. So that is also another reason why policy focus needs to shift back on inequality concerns. Next slide, please. So what are you going to hear for the rest of the presentation of Shweta? We're going to talk about how to build forward fairer through coordinated government action on three fronts. Fiscal policy, which is discussed in detail in chapter 3. Central banking, what is the potential new role for central banking in this vein, chapter 4, and how to engineer or manage structural transformation, which is highlighted in chapter 5. Thank you very much, and over to you, Shweta.
Thank you, Hamza. So as Hamza mentioned, that addressing this gap will require coordinated government action at all fronts, fiscal, monetary, and structural. So first, let's analyze the role of governments in reducing inequality through fiscal policy measures. The role of fiscal policy in tackling inequality is very well known. However, what is often tied with the misconception that more spending equals more impact, but this is far from case. So here you can see the chart shows the total impact of education expenditure on inequality reduction, and each dot on this represents a country. So for a country represented by the lowermost dot, we find that 1% spending on education will reduce in total inequality by 1.5 Gini points. Now, if you look at that point right at the top near the horizontal line, for that country, spending on education has no impact on reducing inequality. So this means that education has an inequality reducing impact, but impact varies across countries depending on the design. The same case is for the health expenditure. Also varies across different countries, although it is almost always in inequality reducing. Same is true for social transfers, direct and indirect. But if we look at tax categories such as direct and indirect taxes and VAT, the overall impact on reducing inequality is marginal. So what is very clear from this picture, just take one point with you, that despite varying outcomes of government expenditures, the impact is the greatest if we spend on education, healthcare, and social transfers. Now, COVID, as Hamza just mentioned, I mean, like, COVID, basically during COVID, there was a lot of spending done by governments, and you can see the increase in expenditures in 2020 and 2021, but they were not matched with revenues, which means governments needed to cover this gap. Hence, debt increased, and debt is on an upward trajectory, and fiscal, of course, having to spend more than your revenues means that deficits had gone up, which means that, as you can see in the right-hand side picture, in 2020, deficits had gone up next. Deficits had actually gone up. However, what we see now is that what we are expecting is a reduction in fiscal deficits means consolidation, and it's quite bad news. partly because historical evidence has suggested that consolidations, when fiscal deficits tend to go down, which means less spending or increasing taxes, either of this would lead to rising inequality, as you can see on the left-hand side. And this has implications for future growth potential as it reduces output of any given economy. And this calls for smart solutions. So in the past, what we have seen in times of stress, expenditures on healthcare, education, and social protection, they tend to get cut first. However, they are the ones that have the biggest impact on reducing inequality. So despite the very strong case for spending sufficiently in these areas, they have historically remained underfunded even before the pandemic. So for Asia-Pacific countries, spending on healthcare has remained historically low. The blue line shows for the Asia-Pacific region compared to global averages. And the same has been true for education, where average spending on education has remained below the recommended 4% of GDP for more than half of the countries in the region, which is in the red bars. And of course, social protection coverage rate remains insufficient across countries in the Asia Pacific. On average, only 46% of the people in the region have some form of social protection. So against this background, it's important to maintain spending in healthcare, education, and social protection, as they have the most impact on inequality reduction. And here, with limited fiscal space, as we've been talking about, we propose spending smart in areas which give the biggest bang for the buck. This means you can do it in 3 ways. First, by ensuring universal health coverage, early age education for all, and universal basic social protection. Now, none of them offer a lot, but all of them offer something actually very fundamental. So healthcare means they shield households from falling into poverty. Early age education means allowing for more and good and fair start into adult life. And providing social protection means ensuring and protecting the vulnerable from unfortunate events, which, if they're left uncatered, can have long-term life consequences. Secondly, it's also time to double the efforts to ensure effective implementation. And this can be done through reducing wasteful spending, as in healthcare. In normal times, 20 to 40% of spending in healthcare is estimated to be wasted. And in times like this, well, it's time to look at carefully where the money is spent and how it's spent. And also removing socioeconomic barriers at all levels of education. And finally, we must ride on the pandemic-induced trend in favor of digitalization to enhance efficiency of our systems. This can be done by deploying digital health technologies, improving efficiency of social protection via the use of digital technologies. So fair to say, spending smart, meaning efficiently cutting wasteful spending and reaching more people, will be key to ensuring equitable future for all. However, all this would require money. And Asia Pacific is generally one region where tax collections have been low at about 20% of GDP compared to advanced countries like the OECD countries at 35% of GDP. And this is mainly due to 2 major systemic problems. One is the non-compliance with existing tax regulations, as you see on the left, and the other is the existence of a large informal workforce. About 68% of workers across the Asia-Pacific region are being employed in the informal economy, which means very low tax collections. So to accelerate action on these 2 challenges, we recommend 3 policy actions. One is governments need to broaden their commitment and strengthen public sector institutions and ensure that all pay their fair share, so that individuals and companies comply with existing regulations, they close all the loopholes in the system and fight illicit financial flows, and then must work towards broadening the tax base, formalizing business activities, bringing informal workforce into the labor force, and also expanding taxation to include digital economy. And lastly, governments must also shift the tax burden from the lowest income households by making corporate and personal income tax more progressive. So in this way, fiscal policy can help promote a more fair and inclusive development. Now, so what fiscal policy had done, it was addressing the symptoms of inequality through, but governments can also play an important role in addressing the root cause of inequality through structural policies. And redistribution through progressive taxes and transfers alone may not be adequate to solve the problem. So here you see in the advanced countries, taxes and transfers do play a role in addressing the symptoms of inequality, as indicated in the red columns. However, in developing countries, their role is very limited due to somehow less fiscal space and also challenges with actually targeting such policies to the right people. In some cases, taxes have been also regressive. So the experience of Asia Pacific between 1990 and 2019 would also suggest that taxes and transfers didn't become much more effective in reducing inequality over time. So here, as you can see in the red columns, in most of the developing Asia countries, inequality did not come down. But even in advanced countries that you see on the right-hand side, increases in taxes and transfers resulted in greater reduction in income Gini. But these red ones are actually not still adequate to fully compensate for the surges in market inequality before taxes, which are the blue columns. On the other hand, most of the reduction in Gini coefficients in Asia-Pacific countries was actually driven by fairer market outcomes before tax and transfers kick in. As you can see in a lot of these countries, Thailand and Iran, and the ones that are in the circle, they are the ones that had much bigger impact on inequality. So what does this suggest? It suggests that we need to proactively shape the structural and market forces that determine inequality levels and trends to begin with. But also, even for fiscal policies, greater attention should be devoted to using taxes and spending to tilt such structural market forces in favor of inclusive development. Now, economic structural transformation provides a very unique lens for understanding inequality dynamics driven by structural and market forces. So here you see the traditional hypothesis of goodness that says the income inequality trend is primarily driven by labor reallocation from low productivity to high productivity sectors, and hence inequality first goes up before it tends to come down. However, this kind of a trend is not so universal and unique, basically, because the link between structural transformation and inequality is influenced by lots of things, like what are the sectors that have led to structural transformation, depends on globalization, availability and access to economic opportunities and technology. So this link is quite complex. However, when we look at the experience of the countries in the region, we do tend to find that there have been some countries that have been able to actually grow they have been able to structurally transform with equity in the region. Such countries have generally been our Asian dragons and tigers in different episodes of the takeoffs, and also some developing countries recently like Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam. However, all this requires very, very thoughtful and thoughtful choice of sectoral strategies and conducive policy combinations. So our analysis in the report, you can see in chapter 5, will show you that there are certain conducive factors, which means creating productive jobs at a fast pace and over a sustained period of time, especially through manufacturing, and providing access to primary and secondary education, equalizing access to infrastructure, giving us fairer starting point to people living in the rural areas. But there are many factors that countries come across that could also be harmful. So on the other hand, something like employment concentration in informal sectors or low productive sectors. If you have a youth bulge and not enough jobs being created, that's going to be hurting an inclusive structural transformation. And of course, job market segmentation would also hurt. Now, all these policy experiences have to be updated now and thought of in a new way. So 2 points I want to make here are, first, that the job creation potential of manufacturing is decreasing. Normally, we've thought of manufacturing being the leading sector, actually leading in structural transformation, but their importance and potential is decreasing, driven by a general shift towards more capital-intensive production in major industrial hubs. So think about it, on the left-hand side, the contribution to growth for manufacturing, which is in blue, has gone down from 22% to about 19.8 to about 20%, actually, slightly low in the recent years. But even its contribution to employment has fallen from about 19.5% to less than 15%. On the other hand, modern services such as ICT, professional services, scientific and technical services, financial services, they have emerged as an engine for structural transformation. In fact, these services tend to actually have, modern services have very many features that are very similar to manufacturing. Back in the days when manufacturing used to lead structural transformation, such as high productivity, high skill intensity, extensive spillovers in other sectors, and tradability. So if you look at this picture again, look at the orange bars, where contribution of these modern services has gone up from about 12% to 16%. And however, on the other hand, even the contribution to employment has doubled from 8% to 16%. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is that right now, the ongoing digital robotic, AI revolution, all these kind of things will lead to more frequent and more severe labor market disruptions. Although we don't foresee, at least right now, a jobless future. However, proactive policies would be needed to ensure that nobody is left behind. And in that case, governments can take actions on 3 different fronts to guide, shape, and manage the structural transformation for equal outcomes. For instance, government can guide to the structural transformation process towards a job-rich path by ensuring resources in appropriate sectors are adequate to create jobs. They can shape the income distribution outcomes of the market by empowering labor and providing equal access to education. And lastly, they can manage the socioeconomic disruptions of technological revolution by ensuring social protection and lifelong learning and vocational education opportunities. So far, we've talked about governments who can shape inclusive societies, but central banks are also policymakers. Central banking for inclusive development, it's quite a relatively new area. Here we'll highlight few ways how central banks can support inclusive development. So while central banks may not be intentional, but they have to understand that a change in monetary policy direction affects different people in different ways. So for instance, if interest rates go down, borrowers will be better off, but retirees who depend on interest income, they'll be worse off. And even when central banks do not have the mandate to promote inclusive development, they should care about income and wealth inequality because it affects the effectiveness of monetary policy. So for instance, in economies where wealth is highly concentrated, lowering interest rates is not going to boost overall consumption spending because rich people don't simply spend more in response to lower interest rates. So in this report, in chapter 4, you can actually look at, we focus on 4 areas of central banking for inclusive development, and they correspond to 4 roles of central bank as monetary policymakers, as official reserve managers, as currency issuers, and as financial regulators. So first, as monetary policymakers, of course, the priority should be to maintain inflation stability. Many Asia-Pacific central banks have achieved their inflation targets in the past years, and they're also expected so to in the coming years, despite some rising inflationary pressure, as Hamza talked about earlier. So now the core mandate has been achieved. What can central banks do to promote inclusiveness? We ask in the report, and we argue that they can better communicate distributional impacts of to the public. They can consider economic inequality when adjusting the policy rate. And they can also allocate part of the asset purchases to social bonds. And next, as official reserve managers, it's very common for central banks to prioritize safety and liquidity. But in our region, in the Asia-Pacific region, reserves are considered more than adequate. So we argue that central banks can pursue reserve management with social gains in mind. So what do we mean by this? We say central banks can analyze how this shift towards this whole social mind shift will affect their portfolio performance. They can set up investment committees that comprises external experts to make reserve allocation decisions. And they can also use part of the excess reserves to fund local social projects. Third, as currency issuers, around half of the central banks in the region are already exploring central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs as they are called. These digital currencies, to make them work for financial inclusion, central banks need to consider various actions. So what can they do? They should design these digital currencies in a way that helps people to rely less on limited banking services. Central banks also need to work with other policymakers to improve digital and financial literacy. And it's also important to note that digital currencies come with certain risks, such as capital flow volatility. So central banks should be mindful of these risks and have mitigation measures in place. Finally, for central banks as financial regulators, we argue that central banks should not only promote financial stability, but also ensure an enabling environment for innovative social finance. So, for example, central banks can develop or harmonize taxonomies for instruments such as social impact bonds and sustainability-linked bonds. They can also provide some financial assistance to cover the high transaction cost in issuing these bonds. So although inclusive central banking is a relatively new idea, there will be some actions that most, if not all, central banks in the region can do. Promoting financial access and literacy is one such example. And to make inclusive central banking a reality, central banks will need to make some internal changes, such as new legal frameworks for issuing digital currencies and working very closely with governments and other financial regulators. So before I wrap up, let me just repeat that something that Ibu Armida had said right at the beginning. COVID-19 has provided us with a unique opportunity to embark on a much more fairer development path, and we can achieve a fairer recovery by ensuring that inclusion is at the center of economic policy making at all levels, fiscal, monetary, and structural, focusing on spending efficiently where the impact is the maximum. Spending on education, healthcare, and social protection provide a big bang for the buck. Expand domestic resources, shifting the tax burden away from low-income households. Here, taxing the digital economy and introducing progressive taxation will be key. And as new technologies disrupt the old system, we need to ensure that we are moving towards a structure that ensures job-rich transformation and empower labor. And looking through a new lens, central banks can play a role in promoting inclusion, and this can be done so by redesigning monetary policy, reserve management, innovative finance, and digital currencies for inclusive development. Thank you, and I'll pass it over to Mitch.
Thank you very much, Sweta, for sharing with us main takeaways from the survey, and also Hamza prior to that for the analysis of the region's performance over the past year. We have just a little bit of tiny bit of time left, and I hope those of you who are tuning in online don't mind if we go over a little bit our scheduled time. But I think I do want to pose just the one question I think that is in a keen interest of everybody these days, and perhaps if I can hand it back over to Hamza for maybe a little bit of more elaboration on exactly how the Ukraine crisis might be affecting the performance in the Asia-Pacific region. You mentioned previously things like food prices are increasing and so on. Could you maybe elaborate just a little bit more on the effects?
Sure, Mitch. Indeed, it is certainly most recent and most pertinent topic at the moment. There are three broad channels through which the Russian-Ukraine crisis are likely to impact economies across the globe and in Asia Pacific. One, of course, I talked about impact on inflation. Russia and Ukraine combined are about 25% of the global supply of wheat, just to give you one example, right? So there's going to be disruption, there's going to be supply issues, and the result is food prices, commodity prices like oil and energy prices are all already rising and may rise even further. This is going to translate into domestic economies, other concerns, economic activity, and so on and so forth. So impact on inflation is one. Number two is disruption to economic activity. They are through trade channels. It varies how much strong the relationship is with Russia, for instance. In Central Asia, the effect is much more pronounced. Channel of remittances, they're going to be affected significantly. Risk perception has increased quite a bit, which is going to affect investment and so on and so forth. So they're going to throw interesting policy questions. So economies have to face the impact or cushion the impact of the Russian-Ukraine crisis war. They need to have continuation of fiscal support, for instance, but do they have the fiscal space or not? They would like to keep interest rates low to support the slowing economy, but can they do that when inflation is rising? right? So they're going to pose some difficult policy questions. The third issue is the impact on fiscal positions directly and overall financing and development prospects. A lot of governments will try already provide subsidies and try not to pass the impact of rising prices to domestic consumers. So they may provide subsidies, but it all depends on whether they have fiscal space to do that in the first place. Then because of the risk perceptions, the daily sovereign bond yields have already risen for several countries who have nothing to do with the crisis to begin with. But it is going to impact their ability to access markets, to raise new financings, to be able to support their economies. So in a nutshell, high inflation, disruption to economic activity, and impact of fiscal positions and financing costs are three key channels through which economies are going to be affected. Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you again, Hamza. So that does bring us to the end of our hour. I know there were some additional questions some of our viewers had submitted, but we have run out of time, and I just want to take the opportunity to once again thank our four speakers, the Executive Secretary of ESCAP, Lan Pritchett, Hamza, and Shweta, again, the lead author of the survey this year. And if I do note that this is her last survey, as she will be departing ESCAP at the end of the month. So thank you again very much, all four of you, for your keen insights. And we've enjoyed this past hour and understanding this the survey and the kind of, I guess, unique take that ESCAP has put on how we can recover better and recover in a more fair manner for all of the people of Asia and the Pacific. Before we sign off, I would like to invite those of you who are still online to just stay, and we're going to screen a short video that we hope to further illustrate and maybe amplify some of the messages that our speaker shared with us today. So thank you everybody for your interest, and again, do stay online. We have a video that we hope you find interesting and entertaining. And again, my final thanks to the four speakers very much. Thank you very much to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Grandma, we worry about you. Please tell us a story about your job as a TV reporter.
Well, it was many years.
Inequality is on the rise. Aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, it has taken away people's lives and dreams. Inflation went up, driven by food and fuel prices, disproportionately affecting the poor. In Asia and the Pacific, the pandemic has doubled the multidimensional poverty level. An additional 85 million people could have been pushed back into extreme poverty, living on $1.9 per day or less. We need to take urgent action, but how?
Our region is experiencing a highly uneven or so-called K-shaped recovery between countries and within countries. Building forward fairer, ensuring an inclusive recovery from the pandemic, and taking an inclusive development path is an imperative.
Thank you, Mrs. Scap. So, how do we leave no one behind? We can't simply return to normal, can we? That normal is blamed for inequality in the first place.
Governments should prioritize spending on healthcare, education, and social protection.
Of course, but increasing spending is not a golden solution. We must spend smart to heal the long-term scars left by the pandemic.
We need to prioritize universal basic healthcare services over everything else. Children receiving high-quality education from their early years is our priority. We must shield people in need. vulnerable groups and informal workers.
Tax fare should be the leading principle for obtaining budget revenues. Nobody and no company should avoid paying their share. Prevention is always better than cure. Before taxes and transfers, we must focus on pre-distributive policies. It's important that we set up countries for success through strong political systems that allow for checks and balances, strong institutional arrangements, and enough job-rich structural transformation that creates opportunities for all. Fast transformation and new technologies will be disruptive. Governments should act more proactively to guide their direction, shape their trajectory, and manage shocks for inclusive outcomes. Can central banks play a role in inclusive development?
We can and we should. I believe it's time for us to step up our game and tackle rises inequality. Right now, only half of the central banks in the region are taking up an inclusive finance agenda, and it's such a missed opportunity. As policymakers, we can make the conduct of monetary policy more mindful about inequality. As investors, we can mobilize part of the $9.1 trillion official reserves in the Asia-Pacific region for social purposes. As currency issuers, we can explore how central bank digital currencies can foster financial inclusion. As financial regulators, we can encourage more use of innovative financial instruments for inclusive development.
Thank you, colleagues. In looking ahead, the Asia-Pacific region must aim for inclusive recovery to promote the well-being of both people and the planet.
Do you maybe have clear and ready-to-use guidelines to tackle inequality?
As a matter of fact, we do. Download the ESCAP flagship publication. Follow our recommendations for building forward fairer.
And it worked, right? It worked, didn't it?
Yes, it did.